Last class, we talked about the United States in the early to mid 1800s between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. Today, we're going to be focusing on Europe and Africa during the 1800s, starting with the United Kingdom, starting with the British Empire, as it was called at the time, and Queen Victoria. So, Victoria became Queen of England in 1837 at the age of 18, very young to become the leader of an entire empire, okay? Not only just a country, but an entire empire with colonies all over the world. Now, she was the granddaughter of King George III. So, King George III, the last British monarch that we have talked about, he was King of England during the French and Indian War and the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars and also the War of 1812. So, he was a very consequential king. He did a lot, he went through a lot during his very long reign as king. And then his granddaughter, Queen Victoria, took over in 1837. Now, her husband's name was Prince Albert, and he was from Germany. So there you have an alliance between Germany and England brought about through this royal marriage. Now, together they had 9 children. They had a very large family, Albert and Victoria, during their marriage. And Albert and Victoria established kind of a tone of politeness and very proper behavior in 19th century Britain. Whenever you hear of something that's Victorian or Victorian era, think of something very, very strict, very conservative, very proper and polite. That is what that time, that era was seen, mostly because of Victoria and her husband Albert and their behavior. So in doing so, they really created a model of a loving family life, a very traditional family life that became the example for all British people to follow. So the Victorian era, as I said, is a time of proper speech and behavior, since Victoria had very strict standards of personal morality. Now, something else significant about this era, she was queen for a very long time, and there are a lot of really great British novels that a lot of them have been turned into movies that were written during the Victorian era. For example, the novels of Charles Dickens, for example, A Christmas Carol and A Tale of Two Cities, those were written during Victoria's reign. Also, the novels of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. If you've ever heard of Sherlock Holmes, that is also set during Queen Victoria's time as queen. Also, something pretty interesting, the very first stamp, the first ever lickable stamp was printed in 1840, and it portrayed Queen Victoria. So if you ever put a stamp on an envelope, which I'm sure you have, the very first ever stamp had Queen Victoria's face on it. Now, sadly, Albert died. Her husband Albert died after they had been married for about 20 years. So in those 20 years, they had 9 children together, and then he died at a fairly young age. And Victoria was just so incredibly overcome with grief that she secluded herself from public life for years, just would not go out in public. And even after she was eventually able to go back out in public, she wore black silk every single day for the rest of her life. Now, that's 40 years. She lived for 40 years after Albert died, and every single day she wore black in mourning over Albert's death. They were so in love that she never was able to get over his death. So despite her very long period of grief, she remained very popular. She was a very popular queen with her people, and she was recognized by most of Europe as a very competent queen. She wasn't seen as like a silly girl or an unintelligent woman. She was seen as a very strong, competent woman as a queen throughout most of Europe. Victoria was also nicknamed the grandmother of Europe because all 9 of her children went on to marry into royal and noble families all across Europe. All sorts of different countries on the continent of Europe, from Spain all the way to Russia. Her family married into those families. So she's really seen as the grandmother of Europe because most of the royal and noble descendants came from her lineage. Now, in the late 1600s, Great Britain became a constitutional monarchy. Make sure you circle that. That's something you definitely need to know for the test. They became a constitutional monarchy. We have talked about what a constitutional monarchy means, how it's different from an absolute monarchy. It means that not only do you have a king or a queen, but you have a king or a queen with limited power, and then you also have a parliament. So under this system of government, you have the monarch sharing power with the parliament, which is kind of like our Congress. Now, most British monarchs of the 1700s and early 1800s had really tried to control the parliament. They wanted it completely under their control, did not like the idea of them not having absolute power, and so they were still very, very powerful despite their parliaments. But under Victoria's reign, democracy had spread throughout much of the world. Remember all those revolutions that took place in Latin America right before she took the throne. And then remember in 1848, there were all those revolutions throughout Europe, including France, that established democracy in so many different countries. So democracy had become very popular, and a lot of English citizens wanted democracy too. So instead of having to go through a revolution, Victoria said, well, why don't I just give the people what they want? So she responded to her people's desire for a more democratic society by shifting political power almost completely to the parliament. All right, so she gave up a lot of her power as queen and gave almost all of it to the parliament while retaining her symbolic head of the state. All right, now this is still how Britain is today. Victoria is the one who really made Britain into the country it is today. When Victoria took the throne, only about 5% of the British population could vote for members of parliament. Okay, that's the political body that people would vote for, the House of Commons anyway, and only 5% of the British population could vote. Okay, it was very restrictive to being a certain type of person. Of course, only men of a certain nobility or status or income were allowed to vote. And Victoria thought that that was wrong. She worked to expand suffrage during her years as a queen. Now, suffrage means the right to vote. It's not suffering. I know those words sound familiar, but suffrage, that means the right to vote. And she wanted more people to have the right to vote. Specifically, she wanted all men to have the right to vote. And by 1884, that had happened in Britain. Nearly all men had obtained the right to vote, mostly because of Victoria's tireless efforts. So most other European countries had similar progress during the 19th century. The 19th century was really a time of blooming of democracy, seeing the example of the United States from the 18th century. Most other Western countries developed some form of democracy during the 19th century. And in the early 20th century, most European nations gave women the right to vote as well. So that did not happen under Victoria's rule. She was dead by then. But in the 20th century, most European nations, and also America, gave women the right to vote. The British Empire was also very adamantly anti-slavery by the time that Victoria took control. By the time she had taken control, slavery had been abolished in the entire British Empire. It was now seen as negative, as something that's very bad. And Victoria and most British people were advocates for freedom around the world. In fact, during the American Civil War, Victoria actually considered supporting the Confederacy because the Confederate culture was more similar to Britain than the Northern culture was. You know, you had the Southern belles and gentlemen and a lot of tradition. So it was kind of similar to England in a lot of ways. However, you had one big difference, and that was slavery. So once President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it became really clear to Victoria that the war was about slavery, and therefore she and Parliament said, okay, we cannot get involved on the side of the Confederacy since this is mostly about slavery, so they decided they would stay neutral. During the Victorian era, Britain was arguably the most powerful country in the world. The British Empire reached its height, the height of its wealth and power, during the reign of Queen Victoria. She was really the most powerful person in the entire world for several decades. And her reign was a period marked by industrial, cultural, political, scientific, and military change. There's a lot of shifts, a lot of change happening within the United Kingdom. And it was also marked by a great expansion of the British Empire, a great physical expansion of their territory. While Victoria was queen, it was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Now, this meant that Britain had colonies all around the world, so that it was always daytime somewhere in the British Empire. Because of the way that the Earth rotates, the sun was always shining on some part of the British Empire. If not in England itself, then maybe in one or more of its colonies. Britain controlled about half of the entire continent of Africa, including the countries of Egypt and South Africa, and most countries in between those two. The British Empire also controlled Ireland. They controlled India, which is where most of their population came. That's the second most populated country in the world. They controlled all of Canada, which is the second largest country in the world by area. And they also controlled Australia, New Zealand, and many more. We're going to see a map in a minute of just how massive the British Empire was under Victoria. The British Empire controlled land on 6 continents. Right, every single continent except for Antarctica, Britain held some land on that continent. So, in addition to being Queen of England, Victoria also had many other titles. She was also the Queen of Ireland and the Queen of Canada, etc., etc. And her favorite title was Empress of India. She loved to be called the Empress of India. That's a title she obtained in 1876, kind of like King Louis XIV loved to be called the Sun King. Queen Victoria loved to be called the Empress of India. She was fascinated by India, absolutely loved that culture. She never went there herself, didn't have modern technology, couldn't fly there. So she never visited India herself, but was always fascinated by it, would hire Indians to work in her palace. So here is the map of the British Empire at its height. Okay? Everything in red belongs to the British Empire. Okay? And Queen Victoria ruled this entire empire from her sitting room right here in London. Sorry, Coach O's on the intercom.
One brief announcement. There will be no 4 o'clock break today. Repeat, there will be no 4 o'clock break today. Thank you.
Everyone's favorite announcement there. All right, so as I was saying, Queen Victoria ruled all of this land, okay, all this territory stretching thousands and thousands of miles right here from her sitting room in London. Okay, all of it was really controlled by that one woman. Now, in the British colonies of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, which was annexed by Victoria in 1839, British colonists really dominated the population. Okay? Most of the population were from Britain. Okay? British people moved to those colonies. You know how the British like to colonize the places that they control. And as Britain industrialized and prospered, so did these colonies. Now, don't get me wrong, imperialism, colonization is always an unequal relationship. The mother country always has a better deal than the colonies. However, sometimes it's very good for the colonies too. For example, when Britain would conquer or take over these areas, a lot of times because of their industrial development, these colonies would prosper as well under Britain's leadership. Australia, for example, was initially a colony for prisoners. Okay, they were originally a colony for prisoners since England's prisons were so overcrowded. They made this massive country of Australia the place where they exiled prisoners. And after their release, convicts could purchase land and settle in Australia. Now, eventually, British settlers joined these former convicts in both Australia and New Zealand because they got word of how great this land was, and they wanted to settle there too. Now, the sheep and wool industry that they developed here really boomed Britain's economy, and Victoria encouraged immigration in colonies like these by offering settlers cheap land. She wanted to kind of relieve the burden on London itself and England itself for being overcrowded. She wanted her people to spread out across the world and use that as her sphere of influence. Now, there was actually a gold rush in Australia just a couple of years after the California gold rush, and this dramatically increased their population due to immigration. So there's a lot more I could say about Victoria. I've read several books about her. I think you should too. Just very interesting, very good monarch in my opinion. She reigned for a total of 64 years. That is a very, very long time. That is almost as long as Queen Elizabeth II, and pretty close to as long as King Louis XIV as well. One of the longest reigning monarchs in history, 64 years, from 1837 until her death in 1901. All right, so that is Queen Victoria and the British Empire. Now we're going to talk about what was going on in other portions of Europe during the 19th century and also what was going on in Africa. So let's start with Italy in the early 1800s. So Italy in the early 1800s was a collection of non-unified nation states, which are kind of like city-states, only bigger. And it really had been that way ever since the fall of Rome. There was no one large unified country of Italy ever since the fall of Rome in 476. And large parts of Italy were ruled by the kings of Austria and Spain. So it's like it wasn't even part of the Italian culture because they were ruled by the kings of different countries. Now, most Italians by the early 1800s really wanted to unify Italy as one nation again. They wanted to become, maybe if not as powerful as ancient Rome, they still wanted to be a part of that culture of ancient Rome and unite as Italians once again. So that is exactly what happened. You have a guy named Victor Emmanuel, who was the king of Piedmont, Sardinia, which was one of the nation states that you saw on the map previously. And he worked to expand his control over other areas of northern Italy. And he was able to do this very brilliantly through diplomacy. And meanwhile, there was an army of Italian patriots who won control of southern Italy. And once these patriots gained control of the southern part of Italy, you see here on the map, they put the areas they conquered under the control of the new Italian king in the north of Italy, Victor Emmanuel. And this continued and continued, and then by 1870, Italy was completely unified as one country for the first time since the fall of Rome. So for the first time in about 1400 years, Italy was its own independent, unified nation again, and it has been ever since. There was another country in Europe that unified at this time from a collection of nation states into one unified country, and that was Germany. Now, to understand that, we first have to go back to the Holy Roman Empire. Remember the Holy Roman Empire? It began in 800 under Charlemagne. It was mostly France and parts of Germany. Then it shifted to mostly modern day Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, that area. And it was dissolved by Napoleon in 1806 when he conquered it. It became the Confederation of the Rhine. Okay, all these German states, including Prussia and Saxony and Bavaria, right, all these German states, individual areas that used to be a part of the Holy Roman Empire, it became the Confederation of the Rhine under Napoleon's control. So if you look at the map on top here, all the areas in every shade of blue was controlled by Napoleon in 1806, and the area right here in the medium shade of blue and the black outline, that was the Confederation of the Rhine. Now, in 1815, after Napoleon was removed, you have 39 states from the former Holy Roman Empire, and they did not want to be the Confederation of the Rhine anymore. Remember, there was the Congress of Vienna that redrew the maps of Europe, the borders on the map of Europe, I should say, and they created the German Confederation, and that you see on the bottom map right here. All the area in the black border is a part of the German Confederation. So this group of German states was controlled by Prussia and Austria-Hungary. Prussia is the area on this map in the blue, and it was also controlled by Austria-Hungary, partially in the red here. Now then there came along a guy named Otto von Bismarck, and he was the prime minister of Prussia, the area in the north of Germany there, modern-day Germany, and he worked to create a new confederation of German states controlled by Prussia alone and not by Austria-Hungary at all. And this led to the unification of Germany. So in 1871, Prussia, which on this map is in the light brown, Prussia and the German states that they controlled defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War. Now, this was just another European war between European powers, but this victory was really significant because it gave those living in the German states this very proud nationalistic feeling, saying, yes, we're Germans. We were able to beat the French. Why? Because we're Germans. So that's why we need to create our own country and unite as one like we used to be. So they united together to form the German Empire with the Prussian king, Wilhelm I, as the emperor, or the Kaiser, which sounds like Caesar. So Kaiser Wilhelm I was his name. And then you had Otto von Bismarck, the former prime minister of Prussia. He became the chancellor of the German Empire. Now, after being united, Germany very quickly became the second most powerful country in Europe, second only to who? Queen Victoria and the British Empire. Now let's shift to Ireland. Okay, while all this was going on in Germany and Italy, and then what we talked about in England as well, something very tragic and unfortunate was happening in Ireland, and that was the potato famine. So from 1845 until 1848, Ireland experienced one of the worst famines in all of world history. If you remember from the Columbian Exchange, potatoes were not native to Ireland or anywhere in the Old World. They were native to the New World. But through the Columbian Exchange, potatoes made their way across the Atlantic to the Old World. They were planted in all sorts of areas, and the place it grew the best was Ireland. Okay, so the Irish diet was almost entirely dependent upon potatoes. And for centuries, you have Irish peasants that depended on potatoes as virtually their sole source of food. Almost all of their meals had potatoes as their main ingredient. And in 1845, you have this plant fungus that appears in Ireland and just destroys, just ruins nearly all of Ireland's potato crop. It was very tragic. And as a result of their dominant crop just being completely and utterly destroyed over the course of a couple years, you have an estimated 1 million people dying from starvation during this time. Now, that was 1/8 of Ireland's population. It completely devastated it. And not only did a lot of people starve and die in Ireland, but since so many people were dying, since so many people were starving and being malnourished, a lot of Irish people said, we are out of here. Okay, we have to leave Ireland. We have to go somewhere more prosperous where we can actually eat and live and survive. So a lot of people responded to the Irish potato famine by fleeing Ireland and immigrating to mostly the United States. So during these years, about 1.5 million people fled from Ireland, immigrated to the U.S. to escape starvation and find a better life. So if you look at the chart on the top there, you see the amount of Irish immigration to the U.S. And here you have the early 1800s. Yeah, you got a little bit there, a little bit there, and then boom, potato famine. Okay, you have hundreds of thousands coming every single year, a total of 1.5 million during this small window of the potato famine. And then you see it dropped off after that. So you have so many Irish people flooding into the United States, and the U.S. still has a very large Irish population. If you look on the map there, you see where in America has the most densely populated Irish communities. All right, so up here you see Boston. Okay, Boston has one of the largest Irish communities in the country. Also, the Southeast, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky. All right, all that area has a lot of Irish people as well. Okay, so one of the dominant population groups, mostly because of the potato famine. Now, just to give you a sense of how destructive this was, most countries have increased their population over the past 150 years. Almost all countries in the world are larger now than they were 150 years ago. Ireland is an exception. Ireland used to have 8 million people. Now they only have about 5 million people because they never really recovered completely, like as far as their population goes, from the potato famine that lasted about 5 years. Now we move on to one of the most terribly influential people in history. It's horrible how influential he was. His name was Karl Marx. Okay? He was a 19th century German immigrant to England, and he wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto. You probably heard me mention communism before in class. You know how much I don't like it. It's a very, very evil philosophy that has caused the deaths of over 100 million people. Okay, we'll get a lot into communism next semester when we get into the 20th century, but the whole concept of communism began in 1848 when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. So in this book, he declared that the only way forward to a better society is total government control of people's lives, total submission to the government, forced atheism, and forced total economic equality. He said that's the only way for poor people to rise out of poverty is for the wealth to be taken from the rich and the middle class and everyone being forced to be equal. How do we make sure that happens? You have one supreme ruler. How do you make sure that everyone is loyal to that ruler? You force them to, or you kill them. You force them to be atheists so they can't believe in a higher power other than the leader of the country. Just a very messed up way to view how to achieve economic equality. But that was Karl Marx's theory, and he wrote this book, and a lot of people read it like, that kind of sounds good on paper. I mean, total equality. I mean, equality is good, right? And eventually, in 1917, a communist country for the first time was established, and that was the Soviet Union. We'll get into that next unit, but for this point anyway, and at this time in the 19th century, it was simply an ideology, something a lot of people were talking about because this book sold so many copies. Now, this idea of communism, once it latched hold in the Soviet Union in 1917, from then throughout the rest of the 1900s, communism would lead to the deaths of an estimated 100 million people. Okay, from the gulags in the Soviet Union to starvation in China, to people being oppressed in Eastern Europe and North Korea and all sorts of other places, Vietnam, it would lead to so many millions of deaths in the 20th century, all in the name of equality. Okay, so very unfortunate, but you do need to know that name, Karl Marx. He wrote the Communist Manifesto. Finally, here we're going to talk about Africa, what was going on the continent of Africa in the 19th century. Well, in the 1800s, European nations took control of nearly all of Africa and made each country a colony. Okay, imperialism was really, really big in the 1800s, especially in Europe, and they saw this massive wealth of resources lying to the south of them. And the African people had less sophisticated technology, so the Europeans were able to conquer the entire continent. They governed and controlled all of it eventually, and this was called imperialism. So if you look at this map here, this is the tradition, this one in the top right. These are the traditional ethnic boundaries of Africa. You see so many different borders. Those are tribes. Okay, each one of those small little country-like things, those are tribes. That's how it was originally. And then imperialism started, and then the Europeans came in and kind of carved up Africa into their own borders, which meant they mixed tribes, which caused some conflict in those tribes, and they were under European control. So there was an abundance of raw materials in Africa that Europeans really wanted to acquire. For example, gold, diamonds. Okay, those things are found in Africa and in many places, and they're not really found anywhere in Europe. So that's one reason why Europeans wanted to colonize Africa for their natural resources. They also wanted to trade, and they wanted to expand their power. And the way you do that is to expand your wealth and to expand your land mass. Europeans also wanted to spread their culture and religion to the Africans. Rudyard Kipling, the writer of the Jungle Book, the book that was turned into a movie, he called this white man's burden, that it's the burden of the white man, of the European, to spread his superior culture, as he put it, throughout Africa. Now, finally, here you have this map of all the countries in Africa and which country controlled them in the 1800s. All right, so you have France, you have Britain, Germany, Portugal, Italy, Belgium, Spain, all the major players in Europe, especially at that time. They all carved off a chunk of Africa for themselves. Now, the colonization of Africa happened shortly after the decolonization of Latin America. Remember, the decolonization of Latin America, all those Latin American revolutions uh, where Brazil broke free from Portugal, and Mexico broke free from Spain, and Haiti broke free from France, and all those different revolutions. That happened from 1800 to 1830. And then now in the mid-1800s, Europe says, well, we lost Latin America. I guess we'll turn to Africa. All right. So then they look to Africa to expand their sphere of influence, and that is exactly what they did. So you see everywhere in the green, that was colonized by France. Everywhere in the orange was colonized by Britain, mostly under Queen Victoria. You have Belgium in the middle there in the yellow. They conquered the Congo. You have Germany conquering places like Tanzania and Cameroon. And in fact, there was only only two places in Africa that remained free, that remained independent nations. And that was Liberia and Ethiopia. Liberia is this country right here, very small country on the west coast of Africa. The only reason Liberia was able to remain free was because that was a country that was kind of established by the United States, and we gave them freedom and wouldn't let the British or any Europeans colonize Liberia. And then you also have Ethiopia. The only reason Ethiopia was able to remain independent is because they had a very strong monarch, very strong king at the time, who kind of made deals with the Italians and the French and the British to leave them alone, and then the Ethiopians would leave them alone as well and be good trade partners there. All right, so this is how Africa was carved up through imperialism, through colonization by the European powers in the 1800s. All right, well, there you have it. Okay, that is Queen Victoria, the British Empire, and Europe and Africa in the 1800s.